The words of our pastoral prayer today are by Reverend Victoria Safford, and she writes, it's called Map of the Journey in Progress. Here is where I found my voice and chose to be brave. Here's a place where I forgave someone against my better judgment, and I survived that. And unexpectedly, amazingly, I became wiser. Here's where I was once forgiven, was ready for once in my life to receive forgiveness and to be transformed. And I survived that also. I lived to tell the tale. This is the place where I said no, more loudly than I thought I ever could. And everybody stared. But I said no loudly anyways, because I knew it must be said. And those staring settled down into harmless, ineffective grumbling, and over me, they had no power anymore. Here's a time and here's another where I laid down my fear and walked right on into it, right up to my neck into that rolling water. Here's where cruelty taught me something, and here's where I was first astonished by gratuitous compassion and knew it for the miracle it was, the requirement it is. It was a trembling time. And here, much later, is where I returned the blessing. Clumsily. It wasn't hard, but I was unaccustomed. It cycled round, and as best I could, I sent it back on out, passed the gift along, and this circular motion around and around has no apparent end. Here's a place, a murky puddle, where I have stumbled more than once and fallen. I don't know yet what to learn there. On this sight I was outraged, and the rage sustains me still. It clarifies my seeing. And here's where something caught me, a warm breeze in late winter, bird song in late summer. Here's where I was told that something was wrong with my eyes, that I see the world strangely. And here's where I said, yes, I know. I walk in beauty. Here is where I began to look with my own eyes and listen with my ears and sing my own song, shaky as it is. Here is where, if by surgeon's knife, my heart was opened up. And here, and here, and here, and here. These are the landmarks of conversion. So I was at a humanist social gathering for the Humanist Society over Zoom the other day, where someone was talking about how they used to be a Unitarian Universalist, and they claimed that for 17 years they felt at home in UU as a humanist, but they said recently UU, and they meant in the past decade or so, has had a crisis of identity, and UU is no longer humanist. And now they said they accept everybody. And my first response to this was that UU was never just humanist. I was actually a little disappointed that in 17 years they weren't able to understand the true essence of Unitarian Universalism. I don't think UU has had an identity crisis. Rather, I think it has been finally coming into its own as the true community of communities, as Paula Cole Jones says, that it aspires to be. And as a humanist myself, I feel that it's vitally important for me to remain a UU and represent humanism within this community of communities. As a person who values open-minded inquiry, I don't want to stay only in spaces where people think and act just like me. To aspire to the greater good of humanity, as humanists say they do, humanists need to be in spaces where we can truly investigate with curiosity the broader human condition. So explaining a bit of my own spiritual journey right now will better illuminate this conviction. And I'll start by saying that my personal religious convictions, as well as the conclusions I've reached, may be difficult for some who identify more religiously than I do. So I request your grace as I move through my story. I wrote the following paragraph a while ago in an essay that I titled, An Atheist, a Humanist, and a Jew Walk into a UU Church. I wrote, according to my late Uncle Saul, I should have studied Hebrew instead of Japanese because I'm Jewish. According to my Orthodox Jewish family members, I am a fallen Jew. And according to my mother, I'm her Jewish atheist humanist son. She hasn't added Unitarian Universalist as of the writing of this essay because it's relatively new to the mix. And to her, either that or she has finally reached her hyphenation limit, and I don't blame her. If you ask me, I'd say I'm a culturally Jewish humanist, Unitarian Universalist, still in process. And thankfully, I haven't been asked lately because it's not that I'm ashamed, it's just that that is an incredible mouthful. So, probably in my early 20s, likely in one of my many attempts to distract myself from thinking about romantic failures or my lack of career focus, I began thinking about my Jewish upbringing. And one of the first things that struck me was a sentiment that I heard, and I still hear quite often from my family and other Jews, which is, as Jews, this is what we celebrate. This is how we pray. This is what we believe. And I finally decided to consider, what do I actually believe? Or, as it turned out, do not believe. And I realized that I thought many of the stories, and even the spin on those stories from the Hebrew Bible, were just as untenable as many of the stories from other divine texts, which my Jewish relatives decried. And I concluded that I would question all dogma. I'll question dogma if it's Jewish, if it's Christian, anything else, even dogmatic humanism. And this process of questioning and exploration culminated in my coming out first as an atheist. And I know that may cause conflict to hear from a minister, but a minister, especially a UU minister, has to be sincere. And all I mean by atheist is that I don't believe in a creator or any supernatural intelligence that has control over my life, which is a very common belief in UU spaces, humanist or otherwise. Now, from there, from atheist, as my thoughts evolved through the months and years, I decided to also consider what I did believe rather than what I merely rejected. And I found humanism. And unlike atheism, which is just about negative beliefs, humanism quite thoroughly confirmed my positive convictions and was much more life-affirming. And as much as I enjoyed thinking things through in my head, which humanism facilitated, I began to then find it harder and harder to deny the constant nagging of my heart to feel things through as well. And I became super determined to show the world that people of faith and faith communities did not have a monopoly on compassion and love. In the somewhat cliched words of the American Humanist Association's catchphrase, I needed to show that you can be good with or without God. So I increased my already active involvement in social justice work. I became a humanist celebrant and eventually began my training as a humanist chaplain as well. And then the journey continued with my entrance into a Unitarian Universalist seminary to acquire a Master of Divinity degree needed to become a board-certified chaplain, and I'll have that degree this year. As I learned more and more about Unitarian Universalism, I began to realize just how much it lined up with my own intellectual and spiritual orientation. In humanist spaces, I felt isolated from anyone not a humanist. It was a similar feeling to what I experienced in Jewish spaces. However, as a UU Jewish humanist, not only were all of my identities welcomed, but it was clear to me that the ideal state of a UU community is acceptance and affirmation of all life-affirming identities and communities. Now, we're still in the process of moving toward this ideal, but UU is the only religion I know of where, rather than assimilation to our way, deference for and adaptation to all legitimate and meaningful ways is the goal and the focus of the spiritual work. And at first, this was quite shocking to my system. This is not how the world works, is it? Our society seems to reward selfishness and insularity. Communities exist separately, not together. My values are mine, yours are yours. Oh yes, they may overlap, even entirely, but we belong to different groups. Well, for the first time, I realized how backward that orientation was. What Unitarian Universalism taught me about humanism was that humans are not only the source of meaning making, as humanists believe, but humankind must also be the object of compassion and affirmation in order to make meaning. Life is only meaningful with kindness, care, sympathy, empathy for, respect, and affirmation of all humans. Now, intellectual search matters, but not at the expense of disparagement of others. If I value intelligence and kindness, why would I dismiss the meaning making of a person who I admire for their intelligence and kindness just because they identify as a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or something other than a humanist? Am I not then behaving the same as the fundamentalist who I criticize? Now, I personally believe that the world will never completely convert to any one single philosophy, including humanism. So to consider that a necessity and live as if that were possible would be as irrational as any similar religious missionary conviction. And now I'm not at all saying that I have to be open to believing in a creator God, or that Jesus is actually divine, or that the Red Sea was parted. I don't, and likely never will, believe those things. But I am saying that it is not unreasonable to find meaning and purpose and moral guidance in these and similar stories that were, after all, created by other humans as they too searched for meaning. Although I celebrate freedom from slavery, for instance, until recently I would not celebrate Passover because I denounce a God who would kill innocent children to punish Pharaoh. But today I can separate those two things and celebrate the freedom of slavery as depicted in that same story. I've looked at our ancestors. African American slaves found meaning in this part of the story to motivate them to hope in the most desperate of times. They found that meaning. Until recently, I didn't celebrate meeting the divine on Mount Sinai, as the Jews did, because it was a God who commanded obedience to their will before anything else. Well, today I can reinterpret that counting of the Omer, which is the days leading up to that, receiving the divine on Mount Sinai, for instance, and I reinterpreted it as a spiritual journey to truly meet the divine that is humankind. I translate it to my humanist language. You see, we all pick and choose, every one of us, what works and what doesn't for ourselves. That's how humans process meaning. And the author, the cognitive scientist, and the psychologist Paul Bloom talked about how humans are pre-wired to think as well as to feel. And instead of dismissing religious people as misguided, he investigates why their belief is so important to them, how they make meaning, and what divinity means to them. And it is incumbent upon me to do the same. If I claim to respect and work toward the humanist ideal of the greater good of all humanity, I must consider the emotional and the psychological realities of being human. I must look closely at the role of human nature, and I must consider with genuine open-minded curiosity why humans hold the beliefs that they do. And what better place than a Unitarian Universalist congregation to do this, where all life-affirming identities are validated? The fact is, the majority of people on earth claim to believe in some religious doctrine or supernaturalism. And once again, the majority is by no means always right. I bring up this fact to convey that spirituality and religion must be meaningful in a significant way. And according to Bloom, again, what a really good contemplative person can do is take religious texts and use them to construct appealing virtues. What religion often does is give people a language to express their moral views. But people do, as I pointed out, pick and choose. So religion can be a useful tool to disseminate morality, but it also can be a justification of immorality. Religion, Bloom writes, provides the language, but the decision of what to say with that language is ours. As a humanist, I've also struggled much with language, with sacred language, and I still struggle with sacred language. However, through my formation as a minister, I've accepted that learning another's language and communicating to them in that language is a matter of respect. I can always translate it in my own head so it's meaningful to me, but using it demonstrates putting the feelings and emotions of others before my own, which is in ultimate service to humanity. And it provides me the opportunity to then share my own language as well. This process of respectful exchange is the ideal of centering the human in humanism. Now, reason and scientific inquiry and individual rights, all of these are all important things. But I find these things are often the focus of humanism at the expense of what is also written in the latest iteration of the Humanist Manifesto, that life's fulfillment emerges from individual participation in the service of humane ideals, and that humans are social by nature and find meaning in relationships. And working to benefit society maximizes individual happiness, not to mention the aspiration of the greater good of humanity. In fact, there is significant alignment between these humanist principles from the manifesto and how we live our UU values. For instance, the aspiration of being in service to humane ideals and that which benefits society is made real by the Unitarian Universalist process of social justice as a spiritual practice. This has also enlightened me about what it really means to be a humanist. As much as separation of church and state, for instance, is an important humanist issue that we have fought for centuries, framing the criminalization of youth of color, for instance, or voting rights, as you're talking about in your session, humanist session, all of these things are humanist imperatives as well. And many of them have been ignored for too long because they're accepted parts of white supremacy culture. In the words of the humanist Sikivu Hutchinson, humanism can't simply dispense with gods and substitute reason and Western individualism for religion, period. In order to find the humanity in humanist practice and action, we can't overlook or ignore the vital human issues that I mentioned, and more human issues like the interlocking oppression of people of color in education, healthcare, housing, criminal justice, or black feminist humanism, for instance, that seeks to center the lives of black women and women of color in critiques of humanist ethics, morality, and justice. We can't ignore them, and in fact, these issues must be addressed first. The humanist Anthony Pinn writes, to omit attention to modes of social justice, like racism, is to reduce the connotation of the human in humanism. Furthermore, it is to truncate the challenges confronting human well-being in the contemporary world. In other words, it goes against all humanism stands for. Now, all of this is to say that through my formation as a Unitarian Universalist minister, I have not given up my identity as a humanist. I've just matured into a better understanding of what it means to uplift, truly and respectfully, all of humanity. I've not given up my atheist convictions either, or my struggle with religious dogma. I just matured into the understanding that my way of making meaning is based on my character and my experience in the world, and is no better and no worse than that of anyone else. I've come to realize in my interactions and experiences that, especially as a humanist minister, I must always be respectful of and curious about what is meaningful to others. In fact, I invite all humanist Unitarian Universalists to take advantage of our unique opportunity. Rather than dismiss or criticize another for their identity or their beliefs, undertake our much touted inclination to investigate with an open mind and find out how someone you respect and admire makes meaning in ways other than you. Learn more about human nature by being grateful for and engaging with UU Christians, UU Jews, UU Buddhists, and all actually of our community of communities inside and outside of UU, as they then reciprocally learn about you. I believe the respect and understanding fostered in Unitarian Universalist community of communities best equips me as a humanist to truly work toward my humanist aspiration of the ultimate good of all humanity. Thank you. And thank you, BUC. I'm so grateful for this wonderful congregation and for your graciousness in hosting me today. I so appreciate being here. For the benediction, I'm going to read some words from the 7th, 8th century Buddhist Shantiveda, from the text called The Way of the Bodhisattva. The words are, Harmful beings are everywhere, like space itself. Impossible it is that all should be suppressed. But let this angry mind alone be overthrown, and it's as though all foes had been subdued.